You know those stories that just get under your skin and you can't shake them? Well, the murder of Ananda Sathasivam back in 1951, Ceylon, Sri Lanka now, is one of those for me. And you know what? Our listeners feel the same way.
It's a story that keeps on giving, doesn't it?
They sent in a ton of stuff on this case, everything from the news stories from back then to analyses that came out way later. And it's got everything you could want in a good true crime story. You know, a beautiful victim, her husband, a famous cricketer no less, accused of killing her, and just a pile of unanswered questions. It's a recipe for obsession.
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher. We've got the reports from back in the day, the court stuff, what the judge said, and then people who looked at all the evidence years later, like that famous forensic guy, Sir Sidney Smith even. It's a really solid set of sources to work with, to really dive deep into this thing.
So that's exactly what we're going to do in this deep dive, right? We're going to take all this material and pull out the heart of the story. We're going to lay out what happened, walk through the different versions of the story, and try to figure out how this whole trial went down and why people are still so fascinated by it all these years later. Our listeners sent all this in because they felt like there was more to the story, and we're here to get to the bottom of it. So let's start at the beginning. October 9th, 1951, early morning. What do we know about the scene at the Sathasivam house? That Sunday Times report paints a pretty vivid picture, doesn't it?
It does. It starts off with a pretty normal domestic scene, actually. The servant boy, the Marambage William. He was pretty new to the job. He was in the kitchen getting lunch ready, rice on the stove, some veggies all chopped up, about to start grating some coconut.
Ah, the calm before the storm, huh?
Right, exactly.
And then something happened, right?
Yeah.
Something that changed everything. And like the Sunday Times said, that interruption, whatever it was, that's the whole mystery, isn't it?
Absolutely. Because right then, the story splits into two totally different versions of what happened.
It's like a fork in the road.
Yeah, exactly. We've got William's story, what he said in court, which the Sunday Times called the bedroom murder. And then there's the version the defense put forward, trying to get Mr. Sathasivam off the hook. They called it the kitchen murder. And these two stories, they just don't add up.
Okay, let's start with William's version, the bedroom murder. What did he say happened after he was interrupted in the kitchen?
So William said that Mr. Sathasivam came into the kitchen, grabbed his arm, like pretty roughly according to the reports, and took him upstairs. And he told William, "I need your help to kill someone," to be quiet. Then they go into the bedroom, and Ananda Sathasivam is sitting on the bed. William says Sathasivam grabbed his wife by the hair and neck, threw her on the floor, and strangled her. Then he tells William to hold her legs down while she's fighting back. And once she was dead, they carried her body downstairs and into the garage, which was right next to the kitchen, but on a lower level. William also said that Sathasivam took a gold necklace and some other jewelry off of his wife and gave it to William before he left the house.
So it's a pretty detailed account, and the Sunday Times even pointed out that it kind of makes sense, right? At least the way they move through the house, it has a sort of logic to it.
Right, exactly. They said that William's story flows, from the kitchen upstairs to the bedroom, then back down to the kitchen level and into the garage. It's linear, which on the surface makes it seem more believable, at least the physical part of it.
Okay, so that's William's story. Now let's flip the script and look at the defense's version, the kitchen murder. How did they try to convince the court that Ananda Sathasivam was killed?
Well, they said that Ananda actually went into the kitchen while William was in there. And they argued that he just snapped, attacked her, strangled her right there in the kitchen, took her jewelry, and then moved her body to the garage.
And the Sunday Times was having none of it, were they? They called it a stretch and compared it to some Martian murder mystery. It's safe to say they weren't buying it, huh?
Nope, not at all. They thought it was ridiculous. I mean, why would a new servant who's probably just happy to have a job suddenly attack and kill the lady of the house while he's in the middle of cooking? It just didn't add up to them.
So no clear motive there. But the defense did try to come up with one, didn't they?
They did. They suggested that maybe William sexually assaulted Ananda and that that's why he killed her. Another way to explain her death that didn't involve the husband.
Okay, so they're trying to paint a different picture. But even the Sunday Times pointed out a piece of evidence that seemed to support the idea of a struggle in the kitchen, right?
Yeah, they mentioned the scratches on William's face that the police found when they arrested him. The defense said those scratches must have come from Ananda fighting back against William when he attacked her in the kitchen. Some physical proof to back up their story.
So we've got two completely different stories here, each with its own little details and evidence. Now let's throw another wrench into the mix, forensic science. This played a huge role in the case. especially because they brought in a real big shot expert.
They did. The defense hired Sir Sidney Smith, this super famous forensic scientist from the University of Edinburgh. He was a big deal, the Regis Professor of Forensic Medicine. People used to compare him to Dr. Joseph Bell, the guy who inspired Sherlock Holmes. Both of them were known for being super observant and using logic to crack tough cases. And get this, Professor G.S.W. Dissarum, the guy who did the first autopsy on Ananda, he was actually one of Sir Sidney Smith's students.
Wow, so this guy was the real deal. And he brought a new perspective to the case, right? Especially with his theory about that injury number 18, I think they called it. What was that all about?
Injury number 18 was a bruise on the back of Ananda's body that they found during the autopsy. The prosecution said, oh, this is from when she hit the bed while fighting William in the bedroom. It fit with William's story, the murder happening upstairs.
But Sir Sidney Smith wasn't so sure, was he?
He had a different take. Using his forensic know-how and some good old-fashioned detective work, he thought that bruise happened when her body hit something sticking out in the kitchen, like a small bump on a wall or a door. He even guessed how high this thing would have to be, about 3.5 feet off the ground. This was a big deal for the defense because it supported their idea that the murder happened in the kitchen, not the bedroom. It's pretty interesting how the same piece of evidence can mean two totally different things depending on how you look at the whole crime, isn't it?
It's like one of those optical illusions, It all depends on your perspective. And then Sir Sidney Smith does something straight out of a Sherlock Holmes book, right? He goes to the Sathasivam house himself.
He did. The Sunday Times said that as soon as he got to Colombo, he went straight to the house and checked out the kitchen, like really carefully. And guess what? He found exactly what he thought he would. A brass fitting nailed into the wall at exactly the height he figured out just by looking at the autopsy report and thinking about how that bruise could have happened. It was like something out of a detective novel. This discovery really gave the defense's kitchen murder theory a boost.
So this tiny detail, a brass fitting, could have changed everything. It's incredible. Now let's talk about the garage, where they actually found Ananda's body. What do we know about that space and how it connected to the rest of the house?
The garage was right next to the kitchen, but a little lower down. There's a small doorway between the two. They didn't actually have a car, so they mostly used the garage for storage. They kept all sorts of stuff in there, firewood, a big wooden mortar and pestle, a rocking horse, a clothes horse, just a bunch of random household things.
And it was a neighbor who found Ananda's body in there, right? How did that happen?
Yeah, it was around 3:30 in the afternoon when a neighbor heard the Sathasivam's 4-year-old daughter. The poor little girl said, "Mommy has a fever. She's sleeping in the garage." The neighbor was worried, obviously, so she went over to the house and found Ananda lying dead on the floor of the garage.
It's just heartbreaking, And there was something else the Sunday Times mentioned about the scene in the garage, something about that wooden mortar they kept in there.
Right? They found this big, heavy wooden mortar lying on top of Ananda's neck. The family's Aya, Miss Putihami, she moved it before the police got there, not realizing that where it was could be important for the investigation. Mm-hmm. The Sunday Times also mentioned a weird detail from the photos of the body. One of her feet was really dirty, but the other one was almost completely clean. That doesn't really make sense, does it? It makes you wonder how and when her body was moved into the garage.
It's like another piece of the puzzle that doesn't quite fit. This case is full of them. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about the legal stuff. One thing that really jumps out from the sources is this letter that Ananda wrote to the police before her husband came back from England. She said she was scared of him. Why wasn't this allowed in court? I mean, it seems pretty relevant, doesn't it?
It does. And the judge, Justice Gratian, talked about it directly in his judgment. The prosecution wanted to use that letter to show that Sathasivam had a reason to kill his wife. But Justice Gratian said, nope, not allowed. He said it was inadmissible, according to Section 32 of the Evidence Ordinance. Basically, the letter just talked about Ananda being scared in general, not specifically about her husband killing her on October 9th. He even mentioned a case from the Privy Council, saying that if a dead person said something, it has to be directly connected to how they died for it to be used as evidence. It's a reminder that just because something's important to the story doesn't mean it could be used in court.
So even though the letter shows that things were bad between Ananda and her husband, it couldn't be used to directly link him to her murder because it wasn't specific enough?
Exactly. Justice Gratian also said the prosecution needed more evidence to back up what Ananda said in the letter, to prove she was scared of her husband after he came back, specifically about him killing her. The letter on its own wasn't enough.
And it wasn't just about following the rules, right? The judge was also worried about how that letter might affect the jury, even though it didn't really have that much solid evidence in it.
Right. He said the evidence in the letter was trifling compared to how much it could hurt Sathasivam's case. He was really focused on making sure Sathasivam got a fair trial, even if it meant leaving out some potentially relevant information. He even quoted this guy, Lord Moulton, who said that if evidence could really sway the jury but wasn't actually that strong, it shouldn't be allowed. It's a tough balance, isn't it? Letting in enough information to get to the truth, but also making sure the trial is fair.
It is. So we've got all this conflicting evidence, different expert opinions, and then the questions about Ananda's letter. But at the end of the day, what did the jury decide about Mahadeva Sathasivam?
They found him not guilty.
Yeah.
They said he didn't do it. And that all came down to this legal idea of reasonable doubt. If the jury wasn't absolutely sure he was guilty, they had to let him go.
And what happened after that? The Sunday Times talked about this unbearable burden of suspicion shifting.
Yeah, as soon as Sathasivam walked free, everyone started looking at William again. He was right there in the courtroom. You had this famous cricketer being cheered as he walked out, and then there's William, suddenly the focus of everyone's suspicion again. The Daily Mirror even said that maybe Sathasivam planned it this way. Maybe he made things confusing on purpose so the jury wouldn't be sure what happened. It means you think maybe creating doubt is the best way to win in court sometimes.
It's a good strategy, and they also brought up the taxi driver's testimony, didn't they?
Yeah, they said the defense did a good job of getting the taxi driver to say that Mrs. Sathasivam had seen her husband off at 10:30 that morning. That would mean Sathasivam couldn't have been at the house when she died, right? Just another thing that made the whole timeline even more confusing.
So there was a lot of focus on the timing. And it's clear that Sathasivam's fame and status played a role in this whole thing. Can you tell us a bit more about him and how that might have affected the investigation and what people thought?
Sathasivam was a big deal. He was like a national hero, a superstar cricketer, considered one of the best batsmen ever. And he was married into a very powerful family. Ananda was the granddaughter of Sir Ponnambalam Ramanathan, a really important figure in Ceylon. But his personal life was a mess. He was having an affair, and he and Ananda were getting divorced. So you've got this mix of fame and scandal, and it created this crazy atmosphere around the case. It makes you wonder, how much does someone's status, their fame and connections, affect how the police investigate them and what people believe? Do you think they would have treated him differently if he was just an average Joe?
That's a good question, and it's hard to know for sure. But some of the sources do suggest that his connections might have influenced how the police handled the investigation, don't they?
Yeah, there were definitely rumors going around. Some of them even ended up in the newspapers.
Yeah.
About people trying to mess with the evidence. Some people said that some of the police might have wanted to get this famous guy, while others said his powerful friends were trying to protect him and make sure he got special treatment. The Daily Mirror even quoted someone from a wealthy family who said they thought the husband was way more likely to have done it than the servant.
It's like everyone had an opinion, but nobody knew for sure. And then you've got these different expert opinions, which didn't help clear things up at all.
Right. The initial autopsy that Professor Dissaram did seemed to point towards William being guilty, which is what the prosecution thought at first. But then Sir Sidney Smith came in with his new ideas, saying that while William probably did it, it happened in the kitchen, which meant Sathasivam might not have been involved. So you have these two experts looking at the same evidence and coming to different conclusions. And that probably had a big impact on the jury. It made it harder for them to be absolutely sure about what happened. It shows you how important expert opinions are in these cases, right? The same evidence can lead to totally different answers depending on who's interpreting it and what their theory is.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces keep changing shape. And then there were all those inconsistencies in the testimonies too, right? Like what the little girl said to the ayah, that's a big one.
Yeah, that's a tough one. She told the ayah that her dad and William carried her mom downstairs and put her in the garage, which doesn't fit with the defense's story at all, right? But the next day, at the inquest, she didn't say anything about it. I mean, she was just a little kid. She'd just gone through something horrible, so who knows what she really saw and had remembered. It just adds another layer of mystery to the whole thing.
It really does. It's amazing that even all these years later, William's still stuck to his original story. In that interview from 2014, he said the same thing he said in court all those years ago.
It's true. He said Sathasivam took him upstairs and they killed Ananda in the bedroom. It's hard to ignore that, isn't it? It makes you wonder if the defense's theory was just a way to try and get Sathasivam off the hook.
Maybe. And their lives after the trial couldn't have been more different, could they?
Not at all. William went back to his village and basically disappeared. He was at the center of this huge case, but then he just faded into obscurity. Sathasivam, on the other hand, he went on to marry Yvonne Stevenson and moved away with his daughters. They say they found happiness there despite everything that happened.
So we've gone through all the details, the different versions of the story, the expert opinions. What have we learned from this deep dive into the Sathasivam murder?
I think what's clear is that sometimes what seems like a simple crime can turn out to be incredibly complicated. The Sathasivam case is like a tangled mess of contradictions and unanswered questions, and it shows how someone's social status can really affect how their case is handled. And even though that idea of reasonable doubt is super important in our legal system, it also means that sometimes people might get away with something, even if there is still a lot of questions. This case shows how hard it can be to find the truth, especially when you're dealing with something that happened a long time ago. Memories are fuzzy and people interpret things in different ways.
And it leaves us wondering, did justice really prevail? And what does it even mean to have reasonable doubt? We're still talking about this case over 60 years later. It's clearly captivated people's imaginations.
Absolutely. This case from Ceylon is a reminder of how complicated people are, how messy the legal system can be, and how much we want to understand what really happened in these big dramatic events. It's a story that just sticks with you.
It really does. So, to all our listeners out there, think about this. When you hear about a crime, especially one involving someone famous or powerful, do you think you're always able to be totally unbiased? Does their status affect how you see them, even if you don't realize it? The Sathasivam case, even though it happened decades ago, forces us to think about those hidden biases we all have and how they can shape our understanding of what's right and wrong. It's a story that makes you think, and that's what we're all about.